Picture this, it's a sweltering summer day on a Hollywood soundstage in 1939, and the most glamorous stars in the world are about to share the screen in what will become cinema history. The cameras are rolling, the lights are blazing, and then someone catches a whiff of something that definitely isn't stardust. Welcome to the reality behind the silver screen, where the glitz and glamour of Golden Age Hollywood often masked some truly shocking hygiene habits that would make modern audiences gag. You think your college roommate was bad? Wait until you hear about what went on behind those dressing room doors in the golden era of cinema. We've all seen those stunning black and white photographs, the perfectly coiffed hair, the immaculate makeup, the radiant smiles beaming from magazine covers and movie posters. These were gods and goddesses, untouchable icons who seemed to exist in a realm of perpetual perfection. But the truth is far more pungent, far more shocking, and infinitely more human than any studio publicity department would ever have admitted. Because while these stars sparkled on screen, many of them absolutely reeked off it. And I'm not exaggerating for effect here. We're talking about some of the biggest names in Hollywood history, people whose faces are still recognized worldwide decades after their deaths, who had personal hygiene habits that would get them kicked off a bus today. Now, before we dive into the deliciously disgusting details, we need to understand something crucial about the era. This wasn't just about lazy celebrities or eccentric behavior. The 1930s and 1940s were a completely different time when it came to cleanliness standards. Daily showers weren't the norm. Many homes didn't even have running hot water or indoor plumbing as we know it today. Deodorant was barely a thing. Commercial antiperspirants had only been invented a few decades earlier, and many people viewed them with suspicion or didn't use them at all. The concept of washing your hair every day would have been considered absolutely bizarre, even damaging to the hair. Most women washed their hair once a week, if that. Men might go even longer. But here's where it gets interesting and where our story really begins. Even accounting for different standards of the time, some Hollywood stars took things to an entirely different level. We're not just talking about people who bathed less frequently than we do today. We're talking about stars who made their co-workers physically ill, who cleared rooms with their body odor, whose breath was so bad it became legendary in the industry, who had such notorious hygiene problems that directors and producers had to stage interventions. These weren't just different times. These were different standards even by the measurements of their own era. And the studios worked overtime to hide these secrets, because nothing shatters the illusion of perfection quite like finding out your favorite matinee idol smells like a gymnasium. Let's start with perhaps the most iconic male star of the entire Golden Age, a man so famous he was literally known as the King of Hollywood. I'm talking about Clark Gable, the impossibly handsome leading man with the pencil mustache, the charming smile, and according to nearly everyone who worked with him, breath that could peel paint off walls. Gable was the epitome of masculinity in his era, starring in legendary films like Gone with the Wind and It Happened One Night, winning an Academy Award, and becoming the template for what a movie star should be. Women swooned over him. Men wanted to be him. And his co-stars dreaded kissing scenes with him. The problem wasn't laziness on Gable's part. It was dental disaster compounded by the limited medical knowledge of the time. In 1933, at the age of 32, Gable suffered from severe periodontal disease, a gum infection so aggressive that his dentist had to extract most of his teeth. This was before modern antibiotics, before contemporary pain management, before current reconstructive techniques. The oral surgery of that era was primitive and often left lasting damage. Gable was fitted with dentures, but they never quite fit properly, and this created an ongoing problem with halitosis that would plague him for the rest of his life and career. Now, imagine you're Vivien Leigh in 1939, preparing to film Gone with the Wind, one of the most anticipated movies of all time. You've been cast as Scarlett O'Hara, the role that will define your career, and you're about to share the screen with the most famous leading man in Hollywood. The scene calls for a passionate kiss, something that will be immortalized in cinema history, viewed by millions of people for generations to come. And then Clark Gable leans in, and you get a whiff of what his co-stars had been whispering about. Leigh later admitted that she absolutely hated kissing Gable because of his breath. She described it as one of the most unpleasant parts of filming one of the greatest movies ever made. Think about that for a moment. The most romantic kiss in cinema history, That iconic scene where Rhett Butler sweeps Scarlett into his arms was actually an exercise in breath-holding and professional discipline for poor Vivien Leigh. But Gable wasn't the only one with secrets. The female stars had their share of shocking habits too. And none perhaps were quite as surprising as Marilyn Monroe, the ultimate symbol of glamour and sensuality. Monroe is still the gold standard for Hollywood beauty decades after her death. The breathy voice, the platinum blonde hair, the hourglass figure, the red lips. She was perfection personified, a goddess made flesh, desired by millions. And according to multiple sources who knew her intimately, including several of her housekeepers and romantic partners, she was also shockingly lackadaisical about personal cleanliness. Monroe's hygiene habits, or lack thereof, weren't just gossip. They were so well documented by people who lived with her and worked closely with her that they've become part of her biography, though often glossed over or omitted entirely in more sanitized accounts. Her second husband, Joe DiMaggio, reportedly was taken aback by her casual approach to bathing. Multiple housekeepers quit working for her because they were so disgusted by the state of her living spaces. One particularly vivid account describes Monroe's habit of eating in bed, a seemingly innocent quirk that becomes significantly less charming when you learn what happened next. She would leave the dirty dishes right there on the bed, sometimes shoving plates with leftover food under the sheets before going to sleep. Imagine lying down for the night and just casually pushing your dinner plate, still with food on it, somewhere down by your feet under the covers. That was apparently standard operating procedure for one of the most famous women in the world. But it gets worse. Monroe rarely bathed with any regularity. We're not talking about the weekly baths that were common in the era. We're talking about going days or even weeks without proper washing. She would apparently shower so infrequently that her makeup artist allegedly kept special wipes on hand because Monroe would show up to shoots in a state that required some emergency cleaning before they could begin working on her face. Several of her former lovers, when interviewed years later with the promise of anonymity, admitted that Monroe's personal cleanliness left much to be desired. One quote that has survived describes her as flatulent, dirty, and eating in bed with the matter-of-fact frankness that suggests this was simply accepted as part of her personality. She also apparently rarely wore underwear, which might sound alluring in a scandalous Hollywood way until you remember all those other hygiene issues we just discussed. And here's what makes it even more fascinating. Monroe's public image was so carefully constructed, so meticulously managed by studio publicists and her own curation of her persona, that most people went to their graves believing she was just as perfect off-screen as she appeared on it. The contrast between the image and the reality was so stark that it's almost hard to believe. But the sources are too numerous and too consistent to dismiss. The woman who represented the pinnacle of desirability apparently had personal habits that would have embarrassed a college student. Then we have Marlon Brando, the method actor who revolutionized American cinema and also revolutionized how bad a major movie star could smell. Brando wasn't just a talented actor. He was a force of nature, bringing a raw, realistic style of performance to films that changed what audiences expected from their leading men. Movies like A Streetcar Named Desire, On the Waterfront, and The Godfather showcased his incredible range and intensity. They also showcased something else to anyone who had to work near him, a complete disregard for regular bathing. Brando was notorious in Hollywood for his refusal to shower regularly. And I'm not talking about missing a day here and there. Multiple sources from film sets reported that he would go weeks without bathing. His trailers and dressing rooms would apparently reek of sweat, alcohol from his drinking, and stale food from his eating habits. Co-stars complained. Directors tried to intervene. Studios attempted to enforce hygiene clauses in his contracts. But Brando, being Brando, simply didn't care. He was enough of a talent and enough of a box office draw that he could basically do whatever he wanted. And what he wanted was apparently to smell like he'd been living in a gym for a month. Tom Cruise, who worked with Brando much later in his career, had to have the set specially deodorized before filming could commence because Brando's personal funk was so overwhelming it was affecting the crew's ability to work. Think about that. We're talking about a smell so bad that professionals who work with hot lights, heavy equipment, and hundreds of people crammed into sound stages for 12-hour days were complaining about the odor. These weren't delicate flowers. These were hardened film industry veterans, and they couldn't handle being around Brando without some serious air freshening happening first. And it wasn't just a late career thing when Brando had gained weight and let himself go. Even in his prime, when he was considered one of the most attractive men in Hollywood, he was allegedly a nightmare to be around from a hygiene perspective. Stories circulated about co-stars drawing straws to see who would have to tell him to take a shower before intimate scenes. Some actresses would request body doubles for any shots that required too much physical proximity. It became one of those open secrets in Hollywood, the kind of thing everyone knew about but no one officially acknowledged. Joan Crawford presents a fascinating case because her hygiene issues went in the complete opposite direction. While many stars on our list were guilty of not cleaning enough, Crawford was obsessed with cleaning to the point of genuine pathology. She suffered from what would today be recognized as obsessive-compulsive disorder with a specific focus on cleanliness and order. But her obsession didn't actually translate into better personal hygiene. If anything, it made things worse in ways that might not be immediately obvious. Crawford's daughter Christina famously wrote about her mother's behavior in the memoir Mommy Dearest, which painted a picture of a woman so obsessed with cleanliness that it became abusive and counterproductive. Crawford would apparently have extreme anxiety about germs and cleanliness, but this manifested in bizarre ways. She would force her children to clean obsessively while she herself engaged in behaviors that were anything but hygienic. The intense stress and anxiety she experienced over cleanliness meant she often neglected basic self-care in favor of controlling her environment. Additionally, Crawford underwent multiple dental procedures that went badly wrong, leading to chronic mouth problems and persistent bad breath that all her obsessive cleaning couldn't fix. The dental problems were particularly severe. In an era when dental care was primitive compared to today's standards, Crawford suffered from significant periodontal issues that required extensive and ultimately unsuccessful interventions. The resulting infections and complications meant that despite her public image of perfection and her private obsession with cleanliness, she struggled with oral hygiene issues that her co-workers definitely noticed. Here was a woman who was fanatical about surfaces being cleaned and recleaned, who would apparently wear white gloves to check for dust, who put her children through absolute hell over cleaning rituals, but who had personal hygiene problems she couldn't control or fix. Jean Harlow, the original blonde bombshell who defined platinum blonde glamour in the 1930s, had hygiene issues that were deeply tragic because they stemmed from serious health problems. Harlow was only 26 when she died, far too young, and her death was hastened by a combination of poor medical care, possibly religious objections to certain treatments, and dental problems that spiraled into something much worse. Harlow developed sepsis, a life-threatening blood infection, after having wisdom teeth extracted. In the 1930s, before antibiotics were widely available, something as routine as a dental procedure could quickly become deadly if infection set in. Harlow's extraction became infected, and the infection spread. Co-star Clark Gable, who worked with her on multiple films, noticed that towards the end of her life she had developed a bloated stomach and her breath smelled of urine, signs of kidney failure that were going undiagnosed or untreated. She also experienced vision problems and other symptoms that indicated her body was shutting down. But even before her final illness, Harlow apparently was not particularly fastidious about dental hygiene, which may have contributed to the severity of the infection when it occurred. Multiple sources from the era suggest she rarely brushed her teeth thoroughly and had poor oral hygiene habits in general. Combined with the primitive state of 1930s dentistry and the lack of effective antibiotics, these habits turned a routine dental procedure into a death sentence for one of the brightest stars in Hollywood. It's a sobering reminder that hygiene wasn't just about comfort or social niceties. In that era, poor hygiene could literally kill you, and it did kill Jean Harlow in a particularly horrible way. Bette Davis, one of the greatest actresses in film history, had a different kind of hygiene problem. She was a chain smoker of absolutely epic proportions. Now, smoking was common in that era, almost universal in Hollywood. Nearly everyone smoked. But Davis took it to another level entirely. She reportedly smoked up to 5 packs of cigarettes a day. 5 packs. That's 100 cigarettes daily. She incorporated smoking into her iconic screen persona so thoroughly that a cigarette became part of her image, like her distinctive voice and her unforgettable eyes. But of course, smoking 5 packs a day has consequences. Davis's breath was legendary for all the wrong reasons. The combination of constant cigarette smoke, tar, nicotine, and the resulting gum disease and tooth problems meant that getting close to Davis was an olfactory experience her co-stars remembered decades later. Her teeth yellowed despite frequent professional cleanings. Her clothes, her hair, her skin, everything about her was saturated with cigarette smoke. Visiting her home was like walking into a tobacco shop. Her cars smelled like ashtrays. Everything in her orbit was permeated with the smell of smoke. And Davis didn't care. In interviews, she was remarkably forthright about her smoking, considering it part of her image and identity. "If I did not smoke a cigarette," she explained to talk show hosts, "they would not know who I was." She smoked so much and so visibly that it became inseparable from Bette Davis the persona. But for people who had to work with her closely, especially in intimate scenes, it was a significant challenge. The smell wasn't just of fresh cigarette smoke, which would be bad enough. It was the accumulated smell of decades of chain smoking, embedded in everything about her, combining with whatever oral health issues the smoking created, resulting in a presence that was as powerful olfactorily as it was dramatically. Errol Flynn, the swashbuckling star of adventure films, had hygiene issues that were, ironically, not actually about being dirty. Flynn was reportedly quite meticulous about showering and grooming, sometimes bathing multiple times a day. But he had another problem entirely, one that wasn't discovered until his autopsy: massive genital warts caused by human papillomavirus. Flynn's legendary womanizing, his countless affairs and sexual encounters, had resulted in an infection so severe that Vancouver's chief pathologist, when conducting Flynn's autopsy, was so struck by the size and extent of the warts that he removed them and preserved them in formaldehyde. Think about what that means. Flynn's sexual behavior was so excessive and so risky that he developed a medical condition noteworthy enough that a pathologist felt it warranted preservation for study. These weren't minor warts. These were described as massive. And while Flynn was alive, while he was conducting his numerous affairs and maintaining his reputation as Hollywood's greatest lover, he was dealing with a condition that had to have been painful, embarrassing, and definitely unsanitary. Yet his image as the ultimate romantic hero persisted unblemished until his death, when the truth quite literally came out on the autopsy table. Vivien Leigh, though she complained about Gable's breath, wasn't without her own problems. Leigh suffered from bipolar disorder at a time when mental illness was poorly understood and inadequately treated. During her manic episodes, her hygiene would deteriorate significantly. She would go days without bathing, would wear the same clothes repeatedly, would neglect basic self-care. Depression would hit, and she would be unable to summon the energy or motivation for personal cleanliness. Her mental health struggles manifested in many ways, and one of them was periodic neglect of hygiene that shocked people who knew her as the elegant, refined actress who played Scarlett O'Hara. The tragedy of Leigh's situation was that it wasn't willful or conscious neglect. It was symptomatic of serious mental health issues that went largely untreated. In the 1940s and 1950s, the options for treating bipolar disorder were extremely limited and often ineffective or even harmful. Leigh was essentially left to manage a severe psychiatric condition without proper medical support, and one of the many ways it affected her life was through her fluctuating ability to maintain personal hygiene. Co-stars would notice when she was entering an episode because her appearance and smell would noticeably change. But because of the stigma surrounding mental illness, this was another one of those things that people whispered about but never officially acknowledged. Montgomery Clift, one of the most talented and troubled actors of his generation, had hygiene issues that were directly tied to his alcoholism and drug addiction. Clift was devastatingly handsome in his early career, often cited as one of the most beautiful men ever to appear on film. But a car accident in 1957 severely injured his face, and his subsequent dependence on alcohol and prescription drugs to manage pain and psychological trauma sent him into a spiral from which he never recovered. During the final years of his life, Clift's personal hygiene deteriorated along with his health and career prospects. He would show up to sets disheveled, unwashed, sometimes still drunk or high from the night before. His clothes would be stained and smelly. He neglected basic grooming. The contrast between the beautiful young man who had burst onto the scene in the late 1940s and the sad, deteriorating figure of the 1960s was so stark that even people who knew him well were shocked. His friend Marilyn Monroe, herself struggling with addiction and mental health issues, famously said, "He's the only person I know who's in worse shape than I am." Clift's hygiene problems weren't about laziness or eccentricity. They were symptoms of severe addiction and untreated trauma. He was a man in terrible pain, both physical and psychological, self-medicating in the only ways available to him, and slowly destroying himself in the process. The neglect of personal hygiene was just one small visible sign of the internal collapse happening behind closed doors. Film studios found him increasingly unemployable not just because of his addiction but because the total package, including his appearance and hygiene, had become so problematic that insurance companies wouldn't cover productions he was involved in. Now, we need to talk about why this happened and why it was so widespread in Hollywood specifically. It wasn't just that people in the 1930s and 1940s had different standards, though that's part of it. There were specific factors related to the film industry that made hygiene problems more common and more severe among movie stars than among the general population. First, there were the working conditions. Film sets in the Golden Age were absolutely brutal. The lights they used generated enormous heat. We're talking about temperatures regularly exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit on sound stages. Actors would sweat profusely under these lights. The heavy makeup they wore, which was necessary for black and white film stock but was incredibly thick and pore-clogging, would mix with the sweat and create a disgusting paste. They would film for 12 or 14 hours straight. Air conditioning was rare. Between takes, they would try to cool down, but the makeup couldn't be completely removed and reapplied without significant time and expense, so they would just touch it up and keep going, adding more layers of makeup over the sweat and grime. Then there were the costumes. Many period films required heavy, elaborate costumes made of wool or other materials that didn't breathe. These costumes would be worn for weeks or even months during production. And here's where it gets really gross. The studios owned these costumes, and they were expensive. So they wouldn't be cleaned between wearings or between actors. The same costume might be worn by multiple actors over multiple productions, with only minimal cleaning or airing out in between. Imagine putting on an elaborate Victorian dress or a military uniform that hasn't been properly washed and has been worn by multiple people in 100-degree heat. The smell would be unimaginable. But that was standard practice. Underwear was even worse. Studios maintained costume stock that included undergarments. These would be worn by actors, returned to the costume department, and then issued to other actors with minimal or no washing. Multiple people have confirmed that it was entirely possible to receive underwear from the studio costume department that had been worn by someone else and wasn't clean. The studios justified this by saying the outer costumes were what appeared on camera, so that's where the budget went. Undergarments that wouldn't be seen weren't worth the expense of proper cleaning. It's absolutely revolting, but it was standard practice. Additionally, movie stars were under enormous pressure to maintain impossible standards of beauty while simultaneously engaging in behaviors that destroyed their health and hygiene. They were expected to be thin, so they took amphetamines that destroyed their teeth and gave them terrible breath. They were expected to be relaxed and natural on camera, so they took barbiturates and drank heavily, which affected their ability to care for themselves. They were expected to work 18-hour days and then attend premieres and parties at night looking perfect, which meant cutting corners somewhere, and often that somewhere was basic hygiene. They would go from the set to an event without time to properly shower or change. They would use perfume and powder to cover smells rather than actually bathing. They would have assistants touch up their makeup rather than actually washing their face. The studio system itself enabled and even encouraged this. Studios had enormous investments in their stars and would do anything to protect that investment and maintain the illusion of perfection. If a star had a hygiene problem, they would try to fix it quietly. Publicists would kill stories. Directors would work around it. Co-stars would be told to endure it. Other actors would be hired specifically for scenes that required close physical contact with the problematic star. Makeup artists and costume people would develop elaborate workarounds. But they wouldn't actually address the underlying problem if the star was big enough or important enough to the studio's bottom line. Clark Gable's breath, Marilyn Monroe's bathing habits, Marlon Brando's smell, all of these were known to studio executives, and all of them were covered up because these stars were simply too valuable to risk offending or alienating with direct confrontation. There's also the simple fact that fame often enables bad behavior. When you're a huge star, people around you are dependent on you for their livelihoods. You're paying their salaries directly or indirectly. They need you to keep working so they can keep working. So they're not going to tell you uncomfortable truths. They're not going to say, "You smell terrible, go take a shower." They're going to smile and deal with it and complain privately but never to your face. This creates a bubble around famous people where they can develop increasingly eccentric or problematic behaviors without getting the normal social feedback that would correct those behaviors in regular people. If you or I showed up to work without showering for a week, our boss would pull us aside and tell us to sort ourselves out. When Clark Gable showed up to set with breath that could strip paint, people just suffered through it because nobody wanted to be the one to tell the king of Hollywood that he had a problem. The pressure and stress of fame contributed too. Many of these stars were dealing with anxiety, depression, addiction, and other issues that affected their ability to care for themselves. The same mental health problems that drove them to self-medicate with alcohol and drugs also manifested in neglect of personal hygiene. When you're deeply depressed or anxious, basic self-care often goes out the window. When you're drinking heavily every day to cope with the pressure of being a public figure, you're not thinking clearly about whether you brushed your teeth. When you're taking pills to wake up and pills to go to sleep and pills to manage your weight, your judgment about everything, including cleanliness, becomes impaired. Let's also consider the simple fact that privacy was different then. Today, we have paparazzi who follow celebrities constantly. We have social media where every moment is documented. We have TMZ and gossip sites and camera phones everywhere. It's much harder for celebrities to hide serious personal problems now because someone's going to catch them on camera looking or smelling bad and it's going to be all over the internet within minutes. But in the golden age, the studios controlled the press. Photographers wouldn't publish unflattering images without studio approval. Journalists who wrote negative stories would find themselves shut out of access to stars and studios. The whole system was designed to maintain the illusion of perfection. So stars could have absolutely disgusting personal habits, and as long as they looked good in the carefully controlled official photographs and film appearances, the public would never know. What's interesting is how this has changed. Modern celebrities still have plenty of their own issues, don't get me wrong. But the hygiene standards for people in the public eye are much higher now. Method acting still exists, but we've collectively decided that there are limits to authenticity. You can be dedicated to your craft without smelling like you haven't showered in a month. The technology has changed too. We have better heating and cooling on sets, so people aren't sweating quite as profusely. We have better makeup that doesn't require the same thickness and heaviness. We have better costumes and proper cleaning services. We have unions that enforce reasonable working hours so people actually have time to go home and bathe properly. We have better understanding of mental health and addiction, so people dealing with those issues can hopefully get treatment before it affects their work and their basic self-care to the degree it did in the Golden Age. The contrast between the carefully constructed public images of Golden Age stars and their actual personal habits is what makes this topic so endlessly fascinating. We look at those old films and photographs and we see perfection. We see the embodiment of glamour and sophistication. We see icons. And then we learn that some of them would clear a room with their body odor, or had breath that made their co-stars gag, or lived in personal squalor that would shock us. It humanizes them in a way that's both sympathetic and repulsive. They were just people, with all the flaws and problems that people have, but they were tasked with maintaining an image of superhuman perfection, and the disconnect between the image and the reality was enormous. These stories also remind us that the past wasn't actually better or more refined than the present. There's a tendency to romanticize the Golden Age, to imagine that people were more elegant and proper and sophisticated back then. And in some ways they were. There were different social standards and expectations. But in many concrete, physical ways, the past was grosser than we like to imagine. People's teeth were worse. Their breath was worse. They bathed less. They wore clothes that weren't cleaned properly. They dealt with medical problems that we could treat easily today. The movie stars who looked like gods and goddesses on screen were, behind the scenes, often dealing with basic hygiene issues that would be considered unacceptable today in any professional environment. And yet, despite all of this, These stars created some of the greatest films ever made. Whatever their personal habits, their professional work spoke for itself. Clark Gable's breath didn't stop Gone with the Wind from becoming one of the most beloved films in history. Marilyn Monroe's bathing habits didn't prevent her from becoming the ultimate sex symbol whose image is still powerful and recognizable decades after her death. Marlon Brando's refusal to shower didn't diminish his revolutionary impact on screen acting. Bette Davis's chain-smoking didn't make her any less of a towering talent who delivered some of the most memorable performances ever committed to film. This is the paradox at the heart of celebrity. We demand that famous people be perfect, but they're human beings with all the flaws and problems that come with that. The Golden Age studios understood this paradox and built an entire system around managing it, hiding the flaws and promoting the perfection. They created an illusion so powerful that we're still somewhat shocked when we learn about the reality underneath. We know intellectually that movie stars are just people, but emotionally we want them to be more than that. We want them to be the gods and goddesses they appear to be on screen. The other thing these stories reveal is how much the culture around hygiene has shifted. What was considered acceptable or at least tolerable in the 1930s and 1940s would be absolutely shocking today. The standards have changed dramatically, and not just for celebrities but for everyone. The daily shower is now considered basic and essential. Clean, fresh-smelling clothes are expected. Dental hygiene is taken seriously. We have products and technologies that make cleanliness easier than ever before. What took significant effort in 1940, heating water for a bath, washing and drying heavy clothes, caring for teeth without modern toothpaste and floss, is now trivially easy. We've become accustomed to a level of cleanliness that would have been difficult to maintain in that era even for people who wanted to. But some of the stars we've discussed weren't just products of their time. They were notable for their poor hygiene even by the standards of their own era. Marlon Brando going weeks without showering wasn't normal even in the 1950s. Marilyn Monroe's slovenly habits were shocking to her housekeepers, who had presumably dealt with plenty of other clients and knew what was typical. Clark Gable's breath was legendary specifically because it was unusually bad. These weren't just people following different norms. These were people whose habits were problematic even in a context where overall standards were lower. The mental health aspect of many of these stories is particularly poignant. Vivien Leigh's hygiene issues during her bipolar episodes, Montgomery Clift's decline into addiction-fueled neglect of himself, Joan Crawford's anxiety-driven obsessions, these weren't character flaws or laziness. These were symptoms of serious psychiatric conditions that weren't properly understood or treated at the time. Today, we would recognize these warning signs and hopefully intervene with proper medical care. In the Golden Age, people suffered, and their suffering manifested in various ways including through poor self-care and hygiene problems. Their stories are tragic not just because of the specific hygiene issues but because those issues were symptoms of deeper problems that robbed them of happiness and, in some cases, of their careers and their lives. There's a certain amount of schadenfreude in hearing these stories, a pleasure in learning that the perfect people weren't actually perfect at all. But there should also be empathy. Many of these stars were working under brutal conditions in an industry that chewed people up and spat them out. They were dealing with pressures and expectations that would break most people. They were coping with mental illness, addiction, and physical health problems in an era when treatment options were limited or non-existent. They were human beings trying to maintain an impossible standard of perfection while dealing with very real human problems, and sometimes they failed at the basic tasks of self-care because they were using all their energy just to survive and keep working. The studios share a lot of the blame here. They created a system that prioritized image over reality, that enabled destructive behaviors as long as the star kept delivering box office returns, that pressured people into situations that damaged their physical and mental health. The same studio system that gave us incredible films also created an environment where stars could be exploited, where their problems could be hidden rather than addressed, where they were simultaneously worshipped and mistreated. The hygiene issues we've discussed are in many ways minor compared to the other abuses of the studio system, but they're emblematic of the larger dysfunction. If studios were willing to let stars work in conditions of poor hygiene, what else were they willing to tolerate? And the answer, as we now know, is quite a lot. It's worth noting that not all Golden Age stars had these problems. Many were quite fastidious about cleanliness and took pride in maintaining themselves properly. Cary Grant was famous for his meticulous grooming. Katharine Hepburn was known for her cleanliness and her practical approach to self-care. Many stars managed to maintain both their professional careers and reasonable personal hygiene despite all the challenges of the era and the industry. So we shouldn't overgeneralize and assume that all old Hollywood was a cesspool of filth. But enough stars had notable problems that it was a genuine phenomenon, something that people in the industry recognized and dealt with regularly. The contrast between different stars is interesting too. Some, like Marilyn Monroe, seem to have genuinely not cared much about cleanliness in their personal lives despite maintaining a perfect public image. Others, like Clark Gable, had hygiene problems that were rooted in medical issues beyond their control. Still others, like Marlon Brando, appeared to deliberately flout conventions about cleanliness as part of a broader rejection of Hollywood norms. And then there were people like Vivien Leigh or Montgomery Clift, whose hygiene problems were clearly symptomatic of serious mental health or addiction issues. There wasn't one single cause or one single type of problem. It was a constellation of issues arising from various sources but all resulting in the same outcome. Stars who smelled bad, looked unkempt, or otherwise failed to maintain the personal hygiene standards even of their own era. What these stories ultimately reveal is the gap between image and reality in Hollywood. The image was carefully curated, expensively maintained, and fiercely protected. The reality was much messier, much more human, and often much more unpleasant. We've pulled back the curtain on that reality, and what we've found is alternately sympathetic, tragic, gross, and darkly funny. These were real people with real problems, and sometimes those problems manifested in ways that their adoring public would have found shocking and disillusioning if they'd known about them at the time. The question of whether we should be telling these stories at all is worth considering. Is there value in knowing that Clark Gable had terrible breath or that Marilyn Monroe rarely bathed? Does it add anything to our understanding of their work or their cultural impact? Does it diminish them in ways that aren't fair or productive? Or does it actually humanize them and make their achievements more impressive by showing that they succeeded despite their personal struggles? I'd argue that there is value in these stories, not as gotcha moments or attempts to tear down icons, but as reminders that perfection is always an illusion. The stars of the Golden Age created incredible work and left a lasting cultural legacy not because they were superhuman, but because they were talented, hard-working people who persevered despite their very human flaws and problems. Learning about their hygiene issues doesn't diminish their films. It doesn't make Gone with the Wind less epic or Marilyn Monroe less beautiful or Marlon Brando less talented. What it does is remind us that great achievements don't require perfection. They require talent, dedication, and work, all of which these stars had in abundance even if they didn't always have time for a shower. These stories also serve as historical documents about changing standards and changing times. Future generations looking back at us will undoubtedly find things about our era shocking or disgusting. Standards change. What seems obvious and essential to us might seem bizarre or excessive to people in the future. The Golden Age stars were people of their time, dealing with the constraints and norms of their era, and sometimes failing to live up even to those standards. But they were also pioneers creating a new art form and a new type of celebrity. The fact that they did this while sometimes smelling terrible is just part of the complicated, messy, human story of early Hollywood. In the end, the lesson from these stories isn't that the stars of old Hollywood were disgusting or that we should judge them harshly. It's that the perfection we see on screen is always constructed, always artificial, and always incomplete. The real people behind the images were complicated, flawed, and human. Some of them had problems with basic hygiene. Many had problems with mental health, addiction, or physical ailments. All of them were trying to navigate an industry and a level of fame that was unprecedented in human history, making up the rules as they went along, succeeding and failing in various ways along the journey. Their hygiene issues are just one small window into the larger reality of what it meant to be a star in the Golden Age of Hollywood. Glamorous and miserable, worshipped and exploited, perfect on screen and deeply imperfect off it. And maybe that's the most important takeaway. The next time you watch an old Hollywood film and marvel at the beauty and perfection on display, remember that it was exactly that, a display. Behind the makeup and the lighting and the carefully framed shots were real people with morning breath and body odor and all the other mundane, unglamorous realities of human existence. They gave us the illusion of perfection, and we accepted it gratefully. But the illusion was never the whole story. The whole story is messier, more complex, sometimes more tragic, occasionally more funny, and always more human than the sanitized version we see on screen. And that's okay. In fact, that might even make their achievements more impressive. They created magic while dealing with all the same basic human challenges the rest of us face. They just did it while the cameras were rolling and the whole world was watching.